3 days had passed since the demonstration in the plaza, and the galaxy had been watching every moment. The diplomatic negotiations had stretched through multiple sessions, with arguments and counter-arguments filling the communication channels between Meridian 7 and the Draveshi homeworld, but finally, an agreement had been reached. The Draveshi Confederacy would sign the non-aggression treaty. Reparations would be paid to affected colony worlds, and Commander Vorath would apologize. Zena stood at the edge of the central plaza as crowds gathered on every observation platform. Representatives from dozens of species had traveled to the station to witness what many were calling the most significant diplomatic event in decades. Station Chief Morix appeared beside her, his thin face showing exhaustion, but also something like hope. "Are you ready for this?" "I have been ready for a long time," Una replied. High Commander Sethrix's holographic image materialized on a large screen above the plaza. His scarred face was carefully neutral, giving away nothing of the fury that surely burned beneath the surface. "Citizens of the galaxy," he began, his deep voice carrying across the plaza speakers. "The Draveshi Confederacy has agreed to the terms negotiated with this station and its representatives." He outlined the treaty provisions in formal language, each word spoken like it cost him something precious. "Furthermore," he continued, "Commander Vorath Kelm will address those assembled as part of these agreements." All eyes turned to the frozen Draveshi commander standing at the center of the plaza. Una walked toward him, the spatial anchor device in her hand. She stopped directly in front of Vorath and looked up into his frozen face. His eyes were watching her, and she could see the calculations happening behind them. 3 days of forced stillness had given him time to think, time to remember everything she had told him, time to observe the station and its people. She wondered what conclusions he had reached. "Commander Vorath," she said quietly, "in a moment I'm going to release you, and when I do, you will have a choice." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You can fulfill your agreement and apologize with whatever grace you can manage, or you can attempt to kill me, which will fail because my device reactivates automatically if my heartbeat exceeds a certain threshold." She paused to let that sink in, but beyond the practical considerations, "I want you to make a real choice, not because you are forced to, but because you understand why it matters." She pressed a sequence on the device, and the spatial anchor field began to contract one by one. The frozen soldiers collapsed as movement returned to their bodies. They gasped and stumbled. Disoriented after 3 days of immobility, medical teams rushed forward to assist them. Vorath was the last to be released. The field around him flickered and dissolved, and he stood swaying for a moment. As his muscles remembered how to work, Una stepped back, but did not run. She simply waited. Vorath steadied himself and looked down at her with an expression she could not read. The plaza had gone completely silent. Every eye was fixed on the massive Draveshi commander and the small human scientist who had brought him to his knees without ever raising a weapon. Vorath's hands flexed at his sides for one long moment. Violence seemed inevitable. Then he straightened his shoulders and turned to face the crowd. "I am Commander Vorath Kelm of the Draveshi Enforcement Unit," he said, his voice rough but clear. 3 days ago, I stood in this plaza and declared that no human could challenge me, and I mocked this species as weak, as powerless, as beneath the notice of true warriors." He paused, and the silence stretched. "I was wrong." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Dr. Una Beek did what no one has ever done before, and she did it not with violence or cruelty, but with patience, with intelligence, and with a determination that I now recognize as true strength. He turned to look at Una. "I have spent 3 days frozen in this plaza, unable to move, unable to speak, able only to watch and think. And during that time I saw things I had never noticed before." His voice lowered. but the speakers carried every word. I saw a human security officer help a frightened young Talani without expecting anything in return. And I saw station workers of many species cooperating to keep this place running. And I saw Dr. Beak come to speak with me, not to gloat or to threaten, but to explain why she had built her device. He faced the crowd again. She told me about Kepler-7, about what soldiers wearing armor like mine did to her home and her family. And she told me she built her containment technology not for conquest, but for protection. Vorath drew a deep breath. I have commanded Dravishi warriors for 30 years, and I have always believed that power was the only thing that mattered. But I understand now that I was missing something important. He looked back at Yuna. Power without purpose is just destruction, and strength without honor is just cruelty. And I owe Dr. Beak and the human species an apology, not because I was forced to give one, but because it is deserved. He performed the Dravishi gesture of acknowledged respect, pressing his fist to his chest and bowing his head. I underestimated humans, and I was wrong to do so. And I will carry this lesson for the rest of my life. The plaza erupted into sound as dozens of species reacted to what they had just witnessed. Some cheered. Some simply stared in disbelief. And a few Dravishi representatives looked like they might collapse from shock. Yuna stepped forward. Commander Vorath, thank you for your words. He met her eyes. You did not humiliate us. And you did not seek revenge, even though you had every reason to. And that restraint is something I do not fully understand. But I respect it. Humans are not warriors, Yuna replied, echoing words she had prepared long ago. We are survivors, and we build walls not to conquer, but to protect what we love. Vorath nodded slowly. Perhaps there is wisdom in that approach. And perhaps the Dravishi have something to learn from species we once dismissed. He straightened to his full height and addressed the crowd one final time. Let it be known that the Dravishi Confederacy will honor the treaties signed this day. And let it also be known that Commander Vorath Count personally vouches for their enforcement. He turned and walked toward the docking bay, where his soldiers were being prepared for departure at the airlock. He paused and looked back at Yuna. What will you do now, Dr. Beak? I will continue my work, building more devices like this one. Yuna shook her head. Building something better, something that protects without trapping, something that resolves conflicts before they begin. Vorath considered this for a long moment. If you ever need assistance with such work, the Dravishi Confederacy owes you a debt. And I always pay my debts. He stepped through the airlock and was gone station. Chief Morix appeared at Yuna's side as the crowds began to disperse. That was extraordinary. It was necessary. Still, you have changed the course of galactic politics today, and history will remember this moment. Yuna smiled faintly. I hope history remembers the right lesson, which is that the strongest force in the universe is not the ability to destroy, but the choice to protect, and that even the mightiest warriors can learn something from those they once dismissed. She walked back toward her laboratory, already thinking about her next project. The galaxy had learned that humans were not to be underestimated. One human scientist had proven that true power lay not in weapons or threats, but in the wisdom to know when force was necessary and the courage to offer peace when it was possible. Behind her, the plaza slowly returned to normal. Trading stalls were restored, vendors resumed their calls, and the station's population moved through their daily routines. But something had changed. Species that had once walked with hunched shoulders and nervous glances now moved with a little more confidence, and when they passed humans in the corridors, there was something new in their eyes. Respect. Yuna reached her laboratory and sat at her workstation. Surrounded by half-finished projects and experimental components, she picked up a blank data tablet and began to sketch new designs. The spatial anchor had served its purpose, but she had never intended it to be her final creation. There were better ways to keep people safe, better ways to resolve conflicts, better ways to build a galaxy where species did not need to fear each other. She just needed to find them, and she would, because that was what humans did. They survived. They learned and they built, and they never stopped trying to make things better. The diplomatic chamber, filled with more holographic representatives than the station had ever hosted at one time, news of the standoff had reached every major government in the galaxy. And suddenly everyone wanted a seat at the table. Yuna stood at the center of the room, surrounded by flickering images of ambassadors, military commanders, and political leaders from 24 species. High Commander Sethrix occupied the largest screen, his scarred face tight with barely contained fury. But he was not alone anymore. The Dravishi government had sent civilian advisors, trade ministers, and legal representatives, which told Yuna that they were finally taking this seriously. "Let us be clear about the situation," said Ambassador Vethis of the Talani Confederation, whose thin voice carried surprising authority. Human scientist has developed technology capable of neutralizing Dravishi warriors, and this fundamentally changes the balance of power in our sector. The technology is dangerous, snapped a Moravan delegate, his scaled face flickering with distrust. It should be destroyed, and the humans should be prosecuted for developing prohibited weapons. It is not a weapon, Yuna said calmly. It does not harm anyone, and the Dravishi soldiers in our plaza are in perfect health, merely unable to move. A distinction without meaning, the Moravan replied. Today you freeze Dravishi warriors, and tomorrow you freeze anyone who disagrees with you. I have held this technology for years, Yuna said, and I have never used it until Commander Vorath publicly threatened violence against humans on this station. Station Chief Morix stepped forward to support her. Dr. Beak acted in response to direct provocation. And we have recordings of Commander Vorath's statements if anyone wishes to review them. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. The Dravishi were not popular, and many of the species present had their own grievances against Vorath's people. High Commander Sethrix spoke through clenched teeth. The provocation does not justify this response, and our soldiers have rights under galactic law. Your soldiers have spent decades ignoring galactic law when it suited them, said a Kalari representative, his glowing eyes fixed on the Dravishi screen. Perhaps this is simply justice finally catching up. The chamber erupted into overlapping arguments as old tensions boiled to the surface. Yuna waited. She had expected this chaos, had even counted on it. The more species that joined the conversation, the harder it would be for the Dravishi to simply threaten their way out of the situation after several minutes. Ambassador Vethis called for order. We are accomplishing nothing with accusations, so let us focus on practical solutions. He turned to Yuna. Dr. Beak, you stated conditions for the release of the Dravishi soldiers, and I would like you to repeat them for this assembly. Yuna nodded and stepped forward. My conditions are 3. And the first is that the Dravishi Confederacy will sign a binding non-aggression treaty with all human colonial territories, guaranteeing that no Dravishi military forces will enter human space without explicit invitation. High Commander Sethrix's image flickered with static, probably from how hard he was gripping his communication controls. Second, Yuna continued, the Dravishi government will pay reparations to the colony worlds that have suffered from raids by Dravishi mercenary companies over the past 20 years. And the amount and distribution of these payments will be determined by an independent commission. You are asking us to admit guilt for actions taken by private military contractors. A Dravishi legal representative interrupted. I'm asking you to take responsibility for the damage done in your name. Yuna replied, whether you call them soldiers or contractors, they wore Dravishi armor and served Dravishi interests. She paused, letting that sink in. Third, Commander Vorath will personally apologize for his conduct on this station, and he will do so publicly. where all witnesses can see and hear. Sethrix's voice came out like gravel scraping against metal. You want a Dravashi commander to humble himself before the galaxy? I want him to acknowledge that his arrogance had consequences. And I want him to demonstrate that Dravashi warriors are capable of more than just threats and violence. The chamber went quiet. Several delegates exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the audacity of the human scientist standing alone against one of the most powerful military forces in known space. These terms are unacceptable, Sethrix said finally. Then your soldiers will remain where they are. We will send our fleet, and they will accomplish nothing. Una replied calmly, the moment you attack this station, I guarantee that I will not survive, and as I have explained, my death makes the containment permanent. We have scientists of our own who have never seen this technology before and will need years to understand it. If they ever do, and during all that time, your elite unit will remain frozen in our plaza as a monument to your failure. She stepped closer to the screen. High Commander, I am not your enemy, and I do not want to keep your soldiers trapped forever. Because all I want is peace for my people and justice for those your forces have harmed. You call this justice? I call it leverage, which is something humans have lacked for too long when dealing with species who respect nothing but strength. A long silence followed then. Surprisingly, one of the Dravashi civilian advisors spoke up. High Commander, if I may, the terms Dr. Beak has outlined, while uncomfortable, are not impossible. Sethrix turned on the advisor with obvious anger. You suggest we submit to human demands? I suggest we consider the alternatives, the advisor replied carefully. Our elite unit remains captured. Our reputation is damaged across the galaxy, and prolonged resistance will only make us appear both weak and unreasonable. Appearing reasonable to lesser species is not a priority. Perhaps it should be. The advisor's words hung in the air like a challenge. Una watched the dynamic shift as other Dravashi representatives began quiet side conversations. The military had pushed their people into this situation, but it seemed the civilians were not entirely willing to follow them into disaster after what felt like an eternity. Sethrix spoke again. We will discuss your terms internally, and this session is suspended until tomorrow. The holographic screens began to flicker off one by one. Ambassador Vethis approached Una as the chamber emptied. You handled that remarkably well. I had a lot of time to prepare. Still, facing down the Dravashi High Command takes courage that most species do not possess. Una shook her head. It is not courage, Ambassador, because courage implies a choice. And I did not feel like I had a choice. What do you mean? I have seen what the Dravashi do when they believe no one can stop them. And I decided a long time ago that I would rather risk everything than let that continue. She excused herself and walked back to the plaza to check on the frozen soldiers' night cycle had begun, and the station's lights had dimmed to simulate evening. The 12 Dravashi warriors stood exactly where she had left them, caught in moments of surprise and Raghavorith's eyes found her immediately. She walked to stand in front of him. The negotiations have begun, she said quietly. Your High Commander is considering my terms. Varith's eyes narrowed with fury. No, you are angry. Una continued. I know you want to destroy me, and maybe you will try when this is over. But I want you to understand something. She sat down on the plaza floor so she could look up at him. I did not do this to humiliate you, and I did not do it for revenge. Even though I have reason for revenge. She told him about Kepler 7. She told him about hiding in the storage compartment, about the sounds she heard, about the years that followed. I built this device because I needed to believe that strength could be contained. She said finally, I needed to know that someone being bigger and stronger did not give them the right to do whatever they wanted. Vorith's eyes had changed as she spoke. The fury was still there, but something else had joined it. Something that looked almost like recognition. Yuna stood up. Tomorrow we will find out if your people are capable of peace. And I hope they are, Commander, because I am very tired of being afraid. She walked away, leaving Varth frozen in the growing darkness, but his eyes followed her until she was out of sight, and for the first time in his life, he was not thinking about how to destroy an enemy. He was thinking about how he had become one. The news spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel by the time Yuna reached her laboratory. Communication networks were already burning with reports of what had happened in the Plaza A. Human had frozen an entire Dravishi unit in place using a device no one had ever seen before Station Chief Morix arrived at her door within the hour, his thin Telani face showing more stress than she had ever seen. The Dravishi High Command has already sent 3 priority transmissions, he said as he entered. They are demanding the immediate release of their soldiers and threatening military action. If we do not comply, Yuna sat at her workstation, the spatial anchor device resting on the table beside her. How much time do we have? Their nearest fleet is 2 days away, but they are already mobilizing. Then we have 2 days to negotiate. Morix made a sound of pure frustration. Negotiate what? Exactly? You have imprisoned their elite warriors without any warning or authorization. And now half the galaxy thinks humans have developed a superweapon. It is not a superweapon, Yuna said calmly. It is a containment tool. The difference matters very little when 12 soldiers are frozen in our plaza and their government is preparing for war. Yuna turned to face him fully. Station Chief, I did not act without thought, and I have a plan. But I need you to trust me. Morix was silent for a long moment. Tell me how this device works. He finally said, help me understand what we are dealing with. Yuna pulled up schematics on her screen and gestured for him to look. Conventional weapons target biology. Whether that means nervous systems, muscle function, chemical processes, or cellular structure. But the Dravishi evolved on a high-gravity world with intense radiation, and their biology adapted to resist almost everything. She pointed to a diagram of the spatial anchor. My device does not target biology at all, because instead it creates what I call a spatial anchor, which is essentially a field that locks matter in its current 3-dimensional position. Locks matter in position? Think of it this way, Yuna explained. When you move, you are actually changing your position in space from one set of coordinates to another. But my field creates a barrier that prevents that change. Anything caught inside the field simply cannot move because the space around it will not allow movement. Morix stared at the schematic with growing unease. This sounds like something that should not exist. The theoretical framework has been known for centuries, but the practical application was considered too dangerous, and the galactic scientific community agreed to restrict research in this area. But you built it anyway. Yuna met his eyes. I had reasons. What reasons could possibly justify this? She was quiet for a moment, gathering memories she usually kept locked away. 12 years ago, a Dravishi mercenary company raided my colony on Kepler 7. And they were hired by a mining corporation to clear out the settlers so they could claim the mineral rights. Morix's expression softened. I did not know. The official records say 23 people died in the raid. But the reality was worse, because the Dravishi did not just kill people, and they made sure everyone who survived understood that resistance was pointless. Yuna's voice remained steady, but her hands had curled into fists at her sides. I was 16 years old, hiding in a storage compartment while soldiers walked through my home, taking whatever they wanted. And do you know what I learned that day, Station Chief? I learned that strength without conscience is just cruelty with better weapons. She uncurled her fists and gestured at the device. So I spent 12 years building something that could stop them. Not to kill them or hurt them, but to prove that their strength was not absolute. Morix was silent for a long moment. And now? Now we negotiate. The Dravishi do not negotiate when they have been humiliated. They will negotiate when they understand the alternative. Before Morix could respond, his communication device chimed with an urgent alert. He checked it, and his face went pale. The Dravishi High Command is requesting an emergency diplomatic session, and they want to speak directly with you. Good, Yuna said. That is the first step. They made their way to the station's diplomatic chamber, a circular room designed to accommodate holographic communications with multiple species simultaneously. The main screen flickered to life and displayed the face of High Commander Sethrix, the supreme leader of the Dravishi military forces. He was older than Vorath, but no less imposing, with scars crossing his face like a map of battles won. Human scientist, Sethrix growled. You have committed an act of war against the Dravishi people. I have defended myself against threats made by your soldiers on neutral ground, Yuna replied. Calmly, your commander Vorath publicly humiliated a human security officer, declared that no human could challenge him, and invited anyone to prove him wrong. A ceremonial challenge is not an invitation for hostile technology. Then, perhaps your commander should be more careful with his invitations. Sethrix's eyes narrowed dangerously. Release my soldiers immediately, or face the consequences. I will release them, Yuna said. After certain conditions are met, you dare make demands of the Dravishi? I dare to protect my people, which is something your soldiers have given me cause to do for 12 years. The chamber went quiet. Yuna stepped closer to the screen. High Commander, your device is keyed to my biometrics, and if I am harmed or killed, the containment field becomes permanent. You are bluffing. I am not. And I suggest you confirm this with whatever scientist you have access to, because the spatial anchor technology I developed has no external override. Sethrix's jaw tightened. What are your conditions? First, the Dravishi Confederacy will sign a non-aggression treaty with all human colonial territories. And second, your government will pay reparations to the worlds your mercenary companies have raided over the past 2 decades. Impossible. Third, Yuna continued as if he had not spoken. Commander Vorath will personally apologize for his conduct on this station. You want Vorath to apologize? I want him to acknowledge that his arrogance led his soldiers into a trap, and I want him to say it where everyone can hear. Sethrix leaned forward, his massive face filling the screen. And if we refuse, then your elite soldiers will remain frozen in our plaza for as long as I live. And I promise you that I will live a very long time. The communication ended abruptly, and the screen went dark. Station. Chief Morix let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for several minutes. That was either very brave or very foolish. It was necessary. Yuna replied. Meanwhile, in the plaza, Commander Vorath remained frozen in his half-turn toward the spot where Yuna had stood. His mind raced with fury and calculation, running through every possible way to destroy this human when he was finally released. But as the hours passed, something else began to creep into his thoughts. He could see the observation platforms from his frozen position, and he watched the station's population move past. Many avoided looking at him, but some stopped and stared, not with fear, but with something that looked almost like satisfaction. These were species the Dravishi had bullied for centuries, and now they were seeing Dravishi warriors helpless for the first time. Earth had never considered how that might feel from the other side. The hours stretched on. His soldiers remained frozen around him. Loyal warriors who had followed him into this humiliation. He had brought them here, had made the challenge, had mocked the human scientist in front of witnesses. Whatever happened next, this was his doing. When a young Telani officer passed by the plaza, she tripped and dropped a stack of data tablets. A human security officer, one Vorath did not recognize, stopped to help her gather them. He spoke to her gently, calming her obvious embarrassment, and sent her on her way with a kind word. The human did not even glance at the frozen Dravishi, simply helped someone who needed it and moved on. Vorath watched this small moment and felt something uncomfortable stir in his chest. It was not rage. It was something he did not have a name for yet, but he had plenty of time to figure it out. The central plaza of Meridian 7 had been cleared of all trading stalls and vendor carts, leaving a wide-open space of polished metal flooring surrounded by observation platforms on 3 levels. Representatives from a dozen species had gathered to watch. Some out of curiosity and others out of fear. Yuna stood near the back of the 2nd level, her modified device hidden beneath the loose fabric of her work jacket. She had not slept the previous night, spending every hour testing and retesting the spatial anchor to ensure it would function as designed. Now, she waited with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that timing was everything. Commander Varth stood at the center of the plaza with his 12 elite warriors, arranged in a perfect semicircle behind him. The black armor of the Dravishi gleamed under the station lights, and every movement they made seemed designed to remind the audience of their power. "Citizens of Meridian 7, Varth announced, his voice amplified by the plaza speakers. "You have been told many things about the Dravishi, and today you will see the truth with your own eyes." He raised one massive arm and pointed at his soldiers. These warriors represent the finest fighting force in the known galaxy, trained from birth, enhanced by centuries of genetic refinement, immune to the weapons that lesser species rely upon for protection. The soldiers began their demonstration, moving through combat forms with terrifying speed and precision. They struck training dummies with enough force to send fragments flying across the plaza. They took stun blasts from security weapons without even slowing down. They shrugged off containment foam like it was water. The message was clear. Nothing could stop them. Yuna watched carefully, noting the patterns of their movement, the spacing between each soldier, the range of Commander Varath's position relative to his unit. The spatial anchor had a maximum effective radius of 40 meters, more than enough to cover the entire group if she positioned herself correctly. Varth called his soldiers to attention and turned to face the crowd. "I have heard rumors," he said with obvious amusement, "that some species believe they have developed new technologies that might prove effective against Dravishi warriors." He spread his arms wide in a gesture of mock invitation. "I welcome any who wish to test this theory, and I make this promise before all witnesses here. Any individual who can restrain even one of my soldiers using non-lethal means will earn my personal respect and the respect of the Dravishi people." He paused, letting his yellow eyes scan the crowd. "But I warn you, failure has consequences, and I do not expect any challenges. Because the truth is simple. No technology, no device, no human trick can control a Dravishi warrior." The word human dripped with contempt. Several species in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A Talani diplomat tried to speak, but Varth waved him silent. "I thought not," the commander said. "You are all wise enough to know your place." Yuna stepped forward to the railing of the observation platform. "I accept your challenge," she said, loud enough for the plaza speakers to carry her voice. The crowd went silent. Varth turned to look at her, and for a moment genuine surprise crossed his face before it was replaced by a wide grin. "A human," he said slowly. "A small human woman wishes to challenge the Dravishi." His soldiers laughed, a deep rumbling sound that echoed through the plaza. "Come down then, little scientist," Varth continued. "I remember you from yesterday, the one with papers and complaints, and now you think you can do what no one else has done." Yuna walked calmly to the stairs and descended to the plaza floor. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching her, could hear whispers in languages she did not speak. Station Chief Morix was somewhere in the crowd, probably regretting his decision to grant her observer access. She stopped 10 meters from Commander Varth and met his gaze without flinching. "You promised a fair test," she said. "Any individual who can restrain even one of your soldiers I did make that promise, Varth agreed, still grinning, and I am a warrior of my word. So I will give you a fair test. He gestured to the youngest member of his unit, a soldier who was still massive by human standards, but slightly smaller than his companions. Soldier Dren is new to the unit, and he will be your target, because I am not without mercy. Dren stepped forward with the confident swagger of someone who had never been defeated. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked down at Una with undisguised contempt. One attempt. Vorath said, "That is all you get." Una reached into her jacket and removed the spatial anchor device. It looked unimpressive. A flat rectangular unit with a simple activation switch and no visible weapons components. What is that supposed to do? Dren laughed. Is it going to ask me politely to stand still? Una pressed the activation switch for one heartbeat. Nothing visible happened. Then Dren stopped moving. His laugh cut off mid-sound, his chest frozen between breaths. His arms locked in their crossed position. The crowd gasped. Vorath's grin faded slightly. Dren, stop playing games, he ordered. But Dren did not respond because Dren could not respond before Vorath could speak again. Another soldier froze in place, then another within 6 seconds. All 12 Dervishi warriors stood perfectly still like statues carved from black stone. Vorath spun toward Una, rage building in his eyes. And then he froze too, his massive body locked in mid-turn, one foot slightly raised, his hand reaching for the weapon at his belt. The plaza was utterly silent. Una walked slowly between the frozen soldiers, examining her handiwork with the calm precision of a scientist. Reviewing experimental results, the spatial anchor was functioning exactly as designed, creating an invisible field that prevented any movement through the space it contained. Dervishi were not paralyzed in any biological sense. Their hearts still beat. Their lungs still processed air at the rate they had been breathing when the field activated. And their minds remained fully aware of everything happening around them, but they could not move, because the space itself refused to let them. She stopped in front of Commander Vorath and looked up into his frozen face. Only his eyes could still move, and they tracked her with a mixture of fury and something that might have been fear. "You said no human could control you," Una said quietly, "but I'm not controlling you, Commander, because control implies influence over your choices, over your will, over your decisions." She held up the device so he could see it clearly. "I am containing you. And there is a very important difference." She stepped back and addressed the watching crowd. "The Dervishi warriors are unharmed, and they will remain unharmed for as long as this field is active. But they will also remain exactly where they are until I decide otherwise." Station Chief Morix pushed through the crowd to reach her. "Dr. Beak, what have you done?" "I have accepted a challenge and won," Una replied. "Commander Vorath promised that anyone who could restrain his soldiers would earn his respect. So I expect he will honor that promise when he is able to speak again." She looked back at Vorath, whose eyes had not stopped following her. Eventually, the crowd began to murmur. Dozens of conversations starting at once as representatives of different species tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Several were already sending messages off station, spreading the news across the galaxy. A human scientist had done what no one believed possible. She had stopped the unstoppably. Una turned and walked toward the exit, the device still active in her hand. Behind her, 12 Dervishi warriors and their commander remained frozen in the plaza, monuments to their own arrogance. Tomorrow, she knew, the real challenge would begin. The Dervishi government would demand answers. Other species would want to know how she had done it and whether she would share the technology. And Commander Vorath, when he was finally released, would want revenge. But for now, in this moment, Una allowed herself a small feeling of satisfaction. She had spent years preparing for this, years building a tool that would ensure no one could ever make her feel helpless again. And today, That tool had worked perfectly. She just hoped she was ready for everything that came next. The station called Meridian 7 floated in the darkness between 3 star systems, and it served as neutral ground for species who would otherwise never speak to each other without weapons drawn. Dr. Unibeak had lived on this station for 4 years now, and she had learned to recognize trouble before it announced itself today. Trouble wore black armor and stood nearly 8 feet tall. The Dravashi Enforcement Unit had arrived 3 hours ago. 12 warriors in perfect formation, marching through the docking bay, like they owned every panel of metal beneath their feet. Their commander walked at the front, a massive figure named Varth Keln, whose reputation stretched across 6 sectors. Yuna watched from the observation deck above the main corridor as the Dravashi moved through the station. She held a cup of cold tea in her hands and said nothing. The Dravashi were known throughout the galaxy for 3 things: their incredible physical strength, their ability to heal from wounds that would kill most species, and their complete immunity to neural disruption technology. Stun weapons did not work on them. Sedatives required doses large enough to kill the person administering them. Control collars sorted out against their unique biology. This made them very confident, and confidence in the Dravashi often looked like contempt for everyone else. Station Chief Morix appeared beside Yuna, his thin Talani frame barely reaching her shoulder. "You should stay in your laboratory today," he said quietly. "I have work in the central hub," Yuna replied. "The work can wait." "Can it?" Morix made a sound that translated roughly as frustrated concern. "The Dravashi are here to investigate suspected smuggling, but we both know that is not the real reason." Yuna nodded slowly. The Dravashi had been pushing against human colonial territory for years, testing boundaries, probing for weakness. This visit to Meridian 7 was a political statement wrapped in the pretense of security cooperation. They want to prove something. Morix continued. "They usually do. Commander Vorath has a particular dislike for humans. I have heard the stories." Morix touched her arm gently. "Please be careful." Dr. Beak. Yuna finished her cold tea and set the cup aside. "I am always careful," she said, and she meant it in ways Morix did not yet understand. She made her way to the central hub through the lower corridors, avoiding the main thoroughfare where the Dravashi patrol was conducting what they called inspections, but the station was not large enough to avoid them. Forever, she turned a corner near the trading plaza and found herself facing a wall of black armor. 3 Dravashi soldiers stood blocking the corridor, and in front of them knelt a human security officer named Thomas Chun. His nose was bleeding and his uniform was torn. Commander Vorath stood over him with one massive hand wrapped around a data tablet that clearly belonged to Thomas. "You dare to question my authority?" Vorath was saying, his voice deep enough to vibrate in Yuna's chest. "I just asked to see your clearance documentation," Thomas managed. "Clearance?" Vorath laughed, and his soldiers laughed with him. "I am Dravashi, little human, and you think papers matter to me?" He tossed the data tablet against the wall, where it shattered into several pieces. "You think your rules apply to warriors who cannot be stopped by your weapons?" Thomas tried to stand, but Vorath placed one foot on his shoulder and pushed him back. "Down. Stay where you belong," the commander said. Yuna should have walked away. Every sensible part of her mind told her to turn around and find another route to her laboratory, but she remembered another time, another place, when Dravashi soldiers had stood over people she loved while she hid in a storage compartment and did nothing. She stepped forward into the corridor. "Commander Vorath," she said, keeping her voice calm. The Dravashi turned to look at her, and his yellow eyes narrowed with amusement. "Another human comes to defend this weakling?" "I am Dr. Unibeak," she said. "I am the senior technical consultant for this station." And Officer Chen was following proper security protocols. Varath removed his foot from Thomas and walked toward Una with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped when he was close enough that she had to crane her neck to meet his eyes. "A scientist," he said, pronouncing the word like an insult. "Tell me, scientist, what will you do if I decide your protocols mean nothing to me?" "I will file a formal complaint with the Galactic Council." Varath laughed again. "Papers and complaints. That is all humans have, yes? No strength, no power, just words and clever little devices that cannot touch us." He leaned down until his face was level with hers. "No human technology can control a Dravishi warrior, and no human has the courage to try. Because you know what would happen to you if you failed." Una held his gaze without blinking. "I understand," she said quietly. "You understand nothing," Varath replied. "But you will learn. All of you will learn that when the Dravishi decide something, it happens. And there is nothing any human can do to stop it." He straightened and gestured to his soldiers. "Let these two go. They are not worth our time." The Dravishi marched away down the corridor, their heavy footsteps echoing off the metal wall. Una helped Thomas to his feet and checked his injuries. "Are you all right?" "I have had worse," Thomas said, though his hands were shaking. "That was brave of you." "Dr. It was not brave," Una replied. "It was necessary." She walked Thomas to the medical bay and then continued to her laboratory, her mind turning over what had just happened. The laboratory was small but filled with equipment that most species would not recognize. Una had spent years collecting components, trading favors, working late into the night cycles on a project that officially did not exist. She sat at her workstation and pulled up schematics on her personal screen. The device was nearly complete. A handheld unit no larger than a communications tablet. It did not target nervous systems like conventional weapons. It did not attempt to disrupt biology or chemistry. Instead, it worked on something far more fundamental. Space itself. Una had discovered years ago that it was possible to create what she called a spatial anchor, a field that blocked matter in its current position by preventing movement through the three-dimensional space around it. Anything caught in the field would simply freeze, not because its muscles stopped working, but because the space containing it refused to allow motion. She had hoped never to use it. She had built it as insurance, as protection, as a promise to herself that she would never be helpless again. But now, watching the Dravishi swagger through the station as if it already belonged to them, she wondered if hope had been a luxury she could no longer afford. Her console chimed with an incoming message from Station Chief Morix. "Dr. Beak, I have just received word that Commander Varath has requested use of the Central Plaza tomorrow, and he intends to conduct what he is calling a security demonstration." "What kind of demonstration?" "A show of force," Morix replied, his voice heavy with worry. "He wants to prove to everyone on this station that the Dravishi cannot be challenged. And he specifically mentioned that he welcomes any attempts to restrain his soldiers using non-lethal means." Una was quiet for a long moment. "I would like to attend as an observer," she said finally. "Una, that is not wise." "Perhaps not, but I would like to attend nonetheless." Morix made another frustrated sound, but eventually agreed to arrange her access after the call ended. Una turned back to her workstation and began the final modifications to her device. Tomorrow, Commander Varath would learn that there was at least one human who was not afraid to try, and he would learn it in front of everyone.